Well, great. We'll go ahead and Todd, go ahead and get started. I can also tell you that our colleagues at Doris Duke were really thrilled to hear that we're going to be doing this.
I hope it comes up to
well, we like to talk. I'd like to just kind of give you my thoughts for a strategy, and Deborah's been working with me on this, is to kind of divide this up into, maybe 2 or 3 conversations, an hour at most each, because I know you have a busy schedule this time of year, but we don't have to cover everything all in one, session, just to kind of put you at ease.
I'm at your disposal.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't know. Maybe you better not leave yourself out of it. As Deborah tells you, we love to do interviews. But so we were thinking of kind of dividing up the conversation. We want to get a sense for you what your intellectual academic autobiography has been, kind of leading up to University of Utah. And then thinking about kind of next phases to talk more about the Doris Duke Native American History Project. Because it turns out when we're looking for our founding documents, and you can appreciate this because we currently have no one in our program who actually was there in the beginning, right? And so this is really a precious kind of opportunity for us to gain more understanding about the origins of that project. So that would be kind of phase 2. And then phase 3 would kind of get your thoughts, as a colleague, as a person who's been at the University of Utah and is worked nationwide, kind of in the state of the field now and what's changed over time since you started. So that was kind of our thoughts for kind of like a 3-part. Does that sound cool?
Good and aggressive. I like it.
Okay, very cool.
And I must say that Deborah did an excellent job of getting me prepared. I watched your legacy program for Sam. It was very well done on the video stream. And I had looked at the questions that Deborah sent forward earlier this morning. I must tell you, it brought back watching Sam operate in his interview with you. What took me back, you can't imagine the level of memory and times with Sam. I have a question for you. I cannot remember his wife's first name.
Oh, Bessie.
Bessie, thank you.
Yes, yeah.
She was always part of the initiative.
Cool. Well, Bessie passed away about 4 or 5 years ago, but we're in very close conversation. I don't know if you ever had the chance to meet any of the sons, Mark or Alan. And Mark is a managing partner at Levin Law, or Levin and Papantonio, which, is just this powerhouse law firm.
Yeah.
They negotiated the big tobacco settlements, the Deepwater Horizon, class actions. And then Alan works, I can't remember, for a brokerage firm in Atlanta, but we're in very close contact. And that'll be another theme, if you don't mind, is we'll kind of get in some of the questions about your remembrances of Sam, because for our community that's especially precious. And so, yeah. So should we go and get started?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, we are here. It is August 13th, 2020. My name is Paul Ortiz. We have on this Zoom coordinated interview Deborah Hendricks, Gregory Thompson, Todd Samuelson, both the latter from the University of Utah. Greg and Todd, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Our pleasure.
Well, wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started with some questions. And Greg, I think that you saw our list that Deborah has put together for us. But we wanted to start by getting a sense of your kind of intellectual and academic biography. Sure. What leads you into becoming, this amazing kind of lifelong librarian, archivist, professor, so on and so forth.
So I'm a kid that grew up. I was born in Bremerton, Washington. My father was welding ships and subs back together in the Bremerton Naval Yards on the across from Seattle at the naval dock there. And I was born in 1943, August 1st. And both my mother and father were from Southwest Colorado and Northwest New Mexico. I have long ancestral lineage in that whole area, beginning from the time when whites first come into the area and start taking land away from particularly the Utes Indians. That there are two major tribes on reservations in the southwest corner of Colorado. And after a period of about 5 years, 6 years, my parents left Bremerton, went to Boston, worked with, my father worked with Reynolds Aluminum Company on the salvage project, buying up old aircraft engines and salvaging the rare resources out of those motors, and then moved to Richmond, Virginia, the center for Reynolds Aluminum, moved then to Denver, and finally back to Durango, Colorado, where I really grew up. Durango is in the far southwest corner of Colorado on the western slope. At the time I was kind of starting out there as a town of probably 4,000 or 5,000. I was there continuous until I left college, which I did. I had just turned 17 to 18 week before I left, and I spent my first year of schooling, academic schooling, at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York, a place called Canton, New York, not far from Potsdam. I left after 1 year, came back to Colorado, had a year at a small school in Durango, Colorado called Fort Lewis College. It has the distinction of being one of the schools in this country that offers free tuition for American Indian students. There are some qualifiers in that, but they did that continually. And I had actually two times at Fort Lewis College, and in both times had good friends coming to the college and having a chance to meet from the reservations surrounding that point of Colorado. I grew up, graduated from Durango High School, public high school, and I, as most freshmen, started out in something quite different from what I wound up in. And I had a 2-year stint, it was about a year actually, with an extra semester at Fort Lewis, and then moved to Colorado State University, where I attended for 2 years, graduated with a BS in business administration and finance. And this was in 1965. So I had a collegiate run for the undergraduate from 61 to 65. And that, as you may know from your reading American history, was right in the middle of the Vietnam War and among some of the big call-ups. And so we all assumed that we were going to be absorbed into that war. I've always had poor eyesight, or I guess that isn't quite the way to say it, but I've had weak eyesight. And so ultimately, I was deferred from going to Vietnam because of that. Took a couple of years, but in the meantime, I came back to Durango after graduating from Fort Collins and CSU, and I decided I wanted to go to get a second undergraduate degree in history, and that I wanted to get a teaching certificate that would be applicable in the state of Colorado and acceptable in New Mexico. And I did that. I took a year and a half Actually, it's about 2 years to accomplish that. And in that time period, I met people who absolutely had a great and huge influence on the direction of my life from then. One was Dr. Robert Delaney. He started what is known as the Center of Southwest Studies at Fort Lewis College. At the time, I was working part-time in the library for a little money, and I got to know him quite well. And I got to know a second individual that was important in my career shaping was Dr. Floyd O'Neil. I think you might have heard me talk a little about him. Dr. O'Neil came as an emergency professor in the summer of 1966 to teach at Fort Lewis College. He came from the University of Utah. He was a PhD seeking graduate student at the time, and amazing person. He's the closest person other than Daniel Borston I've been around who I thought was a true Renaissance educator and scholar and learned person. And I had two buddies that were of my same age. We'd graduated from high school. We all had reemerged at Fort Lewis at this time of 1966, 67, and the fall of 65. We immediately saw Dr. O'Neil as somebody who was very serious about scholarship, learning, and quite gregarious. He came, two of us were working in the library, and this guy kept coming in the first 2 weeks of when he was on campus with a handful, a stack of books to be ordered by the acquisitions department at the small Fort Lewis College library. And of course, that got a lot of attention. That didn't happen in a small school and in a isolated community like Durango in Fort Lewis College. And so we sought him out and became acquainted with him. We would meet him at about 9 o'clock every evening for coffee and on campus. And then I took class, and so did my two colleagues. We all took classes from him during the summer. It turned out that I continued to maintain a communication with Dr. O'Neil. And in the spring, he knew we were all hustling to get to grad school. That was the deal, was all three of us. And we all made it. It took a bit of doing, but we did make it. And I got a call from Dr. O'Neil in, I think it was about the 14th or it was probably the 7th or 8th of April in 1970 or 67. And he said, "Are you still interested in grad school? I think I can get you a job, and we probably can get you into the history program at the University of Utah." And I said, absolutely. In 2 weeks, I was in Salt Lake City and living on Dr. O'Neil's couch. And I was employed by the Center for Western Studies, the forerunning title for the American West Center, under the leadership of C. Gregory Crampton. And I was hired to be part of the Doris Duke American Indian Project. And I was hired in part because, having grown up where I did, I grew up around and involved with 3 reservations. And when Dr. Crampton and Dr. O'Neil, or at that time Floyd O'Neil, but Dr. O'Neil, came over to interview me at Fort Lewis, we talked about that. And I had the advantage of having both sides of my family engaged in fairly deeply with those 2 of those tribes. Hickory Apache was the furthest away. The other 2 were Navajo and the Ute tribes that were in Colorado. And so it was a pretty natural thing for me, although I had never thought about being an American Indian historian or a historian of the American Indian And I had thought more about perhaps being a more national history focused teaching faculty member was kind of my goal when I started out. So I joined the Doris Duke Oral History program in the American West Center on April 23rd, I believe, about 23rd, 24th in 1967. The project had, as I mentioned the other day, the project was actually funded by notification in 1966 in December. And the representatives of Doris Duke had approached Dr. Crampton. So he begins the project after the first of the year, hires a secretary, and he approaches, along with the chair of the history department, Dr. O'Neil, to be involved. It happened that Dr. O'Neil had literally grown up on the Uinta and Ouray Reservation of the Ute Nation located in eastern Utah. And he actually could understand and speak Ute, although he never much let that on. And it was interesting to have that capability when we were working. We worked deeply with all three Ute reservations, and two in Colorado, one in Utah. And even though he knew a number of people on the Utah reservation, and they knew him, and they knew he understood Ute, but it was quite a help. Floyd was a natural for doing what he did, and his role for the Duke Project was field director. And he knew how to engage with tribal people, with business committees and tribal councils. He was superb at listening and being patient and being very appropriate. Some of both the northern Utes and the southern Utes had some experiences with anthropology departments that had not been too positive. And so when we approached them with becoming involved in the Duke Project, it took some doing, some negotiation, and a bit of time for them to understand the nature of the project, that it could be helpful to themselves, and that perhaps these two white guys could be trusted to do what they said they were going to do. And by then I was 23, 24 years old. That was a huge education to have that experience. And
Greg, I wonder if we could maybe pause at that moment, because I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your dissertation, but also actually earlier. And you mentioned settler colonialism, the land loss
right.
that Utes and other tribes experienced in the Southwest. When you were growing up, did you experience and witness anti-Native American discrimination, prejudice in your experiences growing up in the Southwest?
Absolutely, it was all around me. I had the advantage of my mother, who was a nurse, had been an Indian nurse at Ignacio, the headquarters for the Southern Utes and their reservation, as well as the first position she held coming out of nursing school was with the VA in Denver, Fitzsimmons. She was a captain by rank as a nurse, had to give that up to marry my dad. And when my mother's people came into southwestern Colorado, they settled on what had been original Ute lands, Aboriginal. When you refer to land claim related issues, Aboriginal lands for the Utes, and then lands that had been at one time part of a larger reservation that is noted today. And so I had that history on both sides of me. My mother continued to be very interested in the American Indians as a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old. Took me to the Gallup All American Indian Fair every August. Huge in the 50s, late 40s and the 50s. This was one of the major gatherings for American Indians, particularly in the west of Oklahoma, although Oklahoma tribes came. I mean, it was a big deal. And we went every year, and she took me into central New Mexico along the Rio Grande Valley, where I learned about some of the Pueblo people. So yes, I was very aware of it, and I watched it in high school, where some of the students came to high school, Indian students, and I had friends in that community that later on became partners in the Duke Project, and so I was. You could not escape it. You would see it on Main Street. There's a long story, and we don't have time to do that. But in my academic career, I kind of very veered off stream there. As I came to Utah, I, of course, entered grad school as a master's student. And I, with some suggestions from both Bob Delaney and Floyd O'Neil, was directed towards studying the Ute peoples themselves, and particularly the Southern Utes. And I wrote a master's thesis on the establishing of the Southern Ute Reservation. My dissertation was on Indian reform for the period of basically 1860s, late 60s through 1900. And so it incorporated some of the master's thesis. But quite frankly, the most important research and writing that I did was in the thesis, and it became an important piece in the settlement and establishment of the Ute Indians' rights to Colorado River water. And so I tell people my master's thesis was a heck of a lot more powerful and important than the dissertation I did. Dissertation was interesting, and I enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed that kind of historic description. But anyway, that's so. It took me quite a while to get through all of that, and the whole time I worked in the American West Center. So I had the first 5 years with the Duke Project, and then we continued on like Sam did with your center. I loved his description to you in the set of questions that you were asking, talking about how he funneled out in an expanding radius the program that I understand to be the foundation of the University of Florida Oral History program today.
Yes. Well, and you had mentioned earlier, Greg, beginning to work on the Doris Duke project, with Professor O'Neil and others. Can you describe what it was like? I mean, it must have been this really remarkable experience and kind of unusual, for an up-and-coming young scholar to be involved in such an amazing endeavor. I mean, what was it like in the early months and years?
Well, I didn't know enough to know how unique it was. And certainly my crystal ball was a little clouded on what the future might bring. Um, but Floyd and Greg Crampton both had a pretty good idea. And Floyd had spent, Floyd was in his early 40s at this period, right at this period. He had graduated as a public school teacher, taught in one of the more interesting counties in Utah called Carbon County, where our coal country is centered. And there he taught immigrant students and the sons and daughters of individuals who were first generation in this country, and all of them, virtually all of them, were associated with the coal country, mining, coal, excuse me. And so he had several things. So he has this background on the American Indian reservation. His father was a farmer, and his family was a farming family. And then they moved to a community called Price, and he gains this background heavily involved with the immigration population in central Utah and teaching. And he's like you, he led both his local teaching association for K-12 teachers, and then led the state program at one point. He had completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Utah. He had associate degree before that from a small school in Price, Eastern Utah Community College. And he was recruited back to Utah by the then chair of the department, David Miller, well-known Western and Mormon historian, to start a graduate program. And that's where I met him. He was in that program. But it's his involvement, his wide involvement, and his unusual leadership as a graduate student, and his incredible teaching abilities that made him a candidate for hire by Crampton. And what became very apparent, and I must tell you that Paul, that I had some real concerns. I came to Utah, and immediately I was thrown in. There were just a few of us. It's kind of like Sam was talking about, in this office, trying to put this program together and get it on the road. And I was going with Floyd out to the Uinta-Ray Reservation. It's about 150 miles from the campus, Salt Lake City, and down to Southern Ute, where I was more familiar, and into northern Navajo country, known as the San Juan County, Utah Navajos, and some of the other tribes in Utah. And I kept thinking to myself, what's the distinction between gathering the history and stealing their history? And how do we define this in a cultural sense? And how do I come to grips? And I had a lot of discussions in a 1964 VW that Floyd owned, that we drove everywhere together, and thousands of miles in that little vehicle, and discussing that. And that was not, Floyd had the vision. He understood essentially what Doris Duke was trying to reach for in her funding of the programs. And he understood that if we didn't make an effort to try to help the tribes define in writing, essentially, their own history now, it would be gone. And it was going pretty fast. So I, after doing some interviews with Floyd was a superb interviewer, as you are, Paul. I saw your expertise at work, and I admire you. Um, and I understood. It took a little while, but I understood then what the importance of this document or this project was all about. And I also understood, because of the way I was brought up, that tribal peoples were under huge amounts of pressure all the time from every direction. And at the same time, I also had learned that these people as individuals were extraordinary, wonderful, usually very, very, they were full of humor, loved to tease you, loved to tease themselves. And they were exciting people to be around. And then there was just the mechanics. So my job in the project, I walked in the door, and I had that same kind of experience that Sam was talking about. They had a Woolworths taping machine, and and they had open reel tapes that were terrible quality. In my background, I'd played around with oral history recording music, and had actually had dipped my finger in some of that. So I brought that expertise, as shallow as it was, into the program, and nobody else had any knowledge. Greg Crampton has this experience probably in that first year. He goes to Havasu, to the Havasupai Indians in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Now, it is a major effort to get down to the bottom of that canyon. And he has this dinky little recorder and some small, probably 3-inch open reel tape rolls. And he records it for several days, comes back to the office, and like Sam, has nothing on the tape. And I don't know what that trip cost, but it was not cheap. And so it helped me convince people you have to spend money on this stuff, and you have to get the best there is. And so part of my job was taking care of all that and trying to make the mechanics for transcribing in place. And because I'd had a little experience kicking around the library, I became the person to try to put together the format that was offered to all the Duke projects in terms of doing the transcription and then the indexing and table of contents, and then how to note that material in a library sense under the Library of Congress format, and using their terminology so that you could, the librarians would be able to identify subject areas that these tapes represented. And so that was my role during the academic year, in the summers and the breaks. Floyd and I would take off, and we would go somewhere to interview, and we'd interview just as hard as we could. And those days were long. Most of the time they were 15, 16 hours long. And but it was a major learning project. And it didn't take very long for me to put that together and understand really what was going on. You mentioned in your introduction about, and Sam talks in his interview with you about how he starts the program there at Florida, and then how it moves forward. And he talks about the beginning session at Arrowhead, I believe it was called. I think that's where Floyd met Sam. I think Floyd, I'll have to go back and look, but I think he was at that same organizational meeting, because for 10 years or so, we were very active in the Oral History Association, and Sam was too. He was president of that, and so forth and so on. And so even after the Duke Project was over, we would meet Sam and Bessie at the oral history sessions and always go to dinner and spend time together. And so it was the way I deepened my friendship with Sam and Bessie in that time period. And what you mentioned at the start, it was hard to introduce oral history as a medium for gathering information that was seen as of authenticity for primary research use. And there was pushback in our faculty and on the campus some. And the Duke Project helped to change that. And I actually taught, I taught both American Indian history and I taught oral history technique practices for faculty, and I had classes in the history department during this time period. It exploded so fast, oral history did, in that period, mid-60s that Sam talked about to you, and after, as an invaluable way to gain information and shape it into repository capacity and capabilities. And and so we watched all that. I mean, we were in the middle of it, and it made our academic life on campus much easier as we went along. But it was a tough sale in the beginning.
Ray, you mentioned earlier, when you're talking about really getting the field work started with the Doris Duke Project, how you had discussions with Floyd O'Neil about, thinking about this earlier history of anthropology, and you're familiar with, now there's a literature and discussing the differences between, working together, with tribes versus just kind of parachuting in, getting the information you want, getting out, writing your dissertation, writing books, kind of academic exploitation, if you will. How did you end up resolving that with Floyd O'Neil? Because at a certain point, it seems like you would have had to really kind of come to a belief that what you were doing wasn't taking advantage of the different tribes.
Here's what helped me immensely. Our approach, like I suspect Sam's approach was, from what I heard, is we would go in the areas where we really wanted to do in-depth oral history work. We would go and we would meet with leadership of the tribe. And of course, these are reservation-based groups that we're dealing with. And we would go have an appointment, often with the chairman of the tribal council or the business committee. We have both versions, same thing, same type of leadership in our area. And we would talk to them in detail about what the project was about, what they should expect from the project, and what we were asking them to do. And what we very quickly, and this was Floyd, it was Floyd's influence, the idea that we would give to the tribes for the right to do the interviewing with their elders. We would return transcripted copies of the interview to the individual and to the council, in effect, for usage in their educational programs. Now, in our area, even then, most of the tribal reservation-based students went to educational institutions off the reservation. The one difference was their Navajo, Central Navajo had boarding schools and so forth and so on. That wasn't true. There was a boarding school in Utah. It was a government school, but the kids all went to elementary school, junior high, and then high school, although very few of them got to high school, quite frankly, in that time period. And so we were fortunate at the Uinta-and-Ouray Reservation in eastern Utah. A young graduate of one of the colleges here in the city, a full-blood Ute, was head of the educational program. He was just out of school and had a lot of energy. Floyd knew him, and he knew his family. He knew his father, who was still alive, and I don't know if he knew his grandfather, but he knew that much. And so we made that connection underneath the tribal business committee and their leadership, so that we were able to get the approval through the council. And I think probably that's the first reservation we got it. And we got it because they knew Floyd and they knew his family. They knew his grandfather, his father, his mother, and they knew him, and they knew his brothers, who were still living close by the reservation. And so all of that helps. And you could see, I could understand better the vision and what was going to happen. And when we went down to Southern Ute, which we did probably in about June 15th or so in 1967, we met with the tribal council there, who was under the leadership of a very progressive chair, and his brother was part of that leadership group. And they came from a family that had leadership responsibilities in the Southern Ute bands for generations. And they understood the importance. And I had two of my friends that I had met at high school and college, who were there working for the tribal group, and they were important in communicating. And they understood what we were trying to do, and they reinforced yes, we need that. We need for our people to be telling their history, and it needs to be documented. And so now I didn't understand all of this in the same way I'm telling you now. Sure. And I'm looking back on it and I say, gee whiz, here, this is an important point, and that's an important point. And so I'm going to extend you just a little bit, and then we can come back to your chronology that you want to follow. As we move through the Duke Project, we are talking about, this would be Floyd and myself in our long hauls. We talked about what are the needs for the tribes coming out of the Duke Initiative. And I'm a fledgling historian, at least I thought I was, and he was finishing up his PhD degree, and which he did finish, and it was on the Uinta-and-Ouray Utes, and it's been a core piece for 50 years of scholarship for everybody that works in that area. He has a teaching background, and I'm trained to be a teacher, a secondary teacher. And what we realized that the tribes needed to be able to develop and present their own history. as tribal history. And so we decide that the next step post Duke is to start working to help tribes do tribal histories with their own people acting as historians and illustrators and writers, so forth and so on. And Floyd convinced first the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then an important group, the Donner Foundation out of New York City. They have a Canadian version and a New York version, to fund projects that would do this. And the idea was to use the National Archives, the Federal Record Centers, and the major repositories in the region to build an archive that the tribe would house, and it would be organized so it could be used for legal purposes, educational purposes, cultural purposes, and anything else that came along. Those were kind of did I say administrative purposes? That as well, and that in addition there would be materials developed with the center assisting and giving the same kind of help you might have in writing a labor history work, with a copy editor, and somebody helping you to manage your manuscript, getting it ready for publication, all of those things. And so the center adopted a program. It became really a genre within the field of history. And that, and I was part of all that. And I was able to, continually reinforced the idea for me that what we were doing with Duke was very important. And the ultimate outlets, I was beginning to see how the ultimate outlets of this would prove to be invaluable.
Nice.
Some of those tribal histories that were developed in the 70s, it went on, still goes on actually, in the American West Center. All of this work was done in the American West Center. As I travel about, I find those works still being used in schools and areas. It's amazing. After all these years, and what was done was the history was developed, it was illustrated, it was bound, hardbound, and presented into the schools through workshops and training sessions for the non-Indian teachers to understand what they had and what they were training. And we had, later on, we had some very talented people, 2 individuals who had, their careers had been working in American Indian education at the K-12 level. And so we really had superb talent to draw on.
Excellent.
And so
Greg,
that.
Yeah. If you don't mind me interrupting you for a sec,
No, you take me back and put me on your track.
No, not at all. So just to clarify, though, when you mention bound volumes, getting those to non-Indian teachers, are you referring to the oral histories that you all did back then? Okay.
They were an important part of that body of documentation from which the tribal history would be written.
Excellent.
So you had agency history, Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, superintendent history, agency history, and then you had the tribal history.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you were also incorporating the regional history surrounding the area where the tribe reservation was located.
Excellent. So, Greg, was that a plan from the beginning? You mentioned earlier the idea visions, but it sounds like you developed a curriculum. This is really talking about a curriculum plan, right?
Yes. It it emerged, and I can almost tell you, I can't tell you quite where we were riding in that VW, bumping across the country at 45 miles an hour, where we got to this point, and certainly Floyd was the leading voice in this, but I absolutely understood. By then I'd had a couple of years in grad school, probably 3, 4, so I was beginning to really collect my sense of being a historian and what history had to offer, and knowing what was needed. We, in that 5-year period of the Duke Project, I don't know, we probably were on 40 different reservations.
Wow.
We worked with 16 to 20, something like that, solidly, but we got around, and I left the American West Center in 1983 to come to the Marriott Library as director of special collections. And by that time, I had been on most of the reservations in the West, and I certainly I'd been to all of the young Indian college programs. We were asked, Floyd was asked from the National Endowment of Humanities in the late 70s to undertake a program to develop a major teaching course for the teaching of American Indian history and the history of the Indians of the Americas. It took about 3 years to do, and we were deeply involved in putting it together. It was an interesting experience, especially trying to prepare a syllabus for teaching the Indians of the Americas. Oh my God, goes on and on. And I actually taught both American Indian and Indians of the Americas from those initiatives. At the end of that grant, we were charged with literally, this is the Fuller Brush man, or the patent medicine guy, going around the West and contacting the small collegiate programs up to the larger ones who were offering American Indian classes without a lot of basis. And the idea that the National Endowment had, and it was correct and it was brilliant, was that these programs needed help. We're coming off that period of the great push for ethnic history and the development and understanding of minority groups, much like we are today. It is so parallel to what was going on in the 60s and the early 70s that I sometimes blur on where we are chronologically. And so we broke the West, and we chose the West basically from the Mississippi River west. We broke it into 4 components, and we did 4 10-day trips on the road of taking these 2 products and going to every academic institution we could find, and stopping and saying, this is what NEH has asked us to do. Does this have any interest to you? And at the end of 40 days of that, we were both loony. And in the Midwest, I'd wake up in the morning. We often stayed at a Ramada Inn or something like it. I'd wake up in the morning and I could not figure out where we were. I was trying to backtrack and so what schools were we at yesterday? But we would drive about 500 miles a day, and I'd have a map out and I'd say, well, there's a place over here. Let's go over there. There's one here now. University of North Dakota is here. We got to go to Grand Rapids and spend some time with those folks. We did that day in and day out. And we had graduated from the VW, thank God. So we
I was
had
just going to ask you, how could you cover that much terrain in 45 miles?
they but it was another one of those incredible experiences coming out of the center, and it taught me a lot to prepare me to go to the Marriott Library and become active in helping to develop their special collections. It also grounded me geographically in the American West. And
Greg, I'm going to ask you to another kind of pause and just
okay.
to let you and Todd know that we'll go, if it's okay with you, we'll go to 12:30, so about 10 more minutes.
Okay.
And then,
are you okay, Todd?
if that's okay, I want to be respectful of your time, and also, schedule, hopefully, this time next week would be fine, but just think about your schedule. But Greg, you mentioned a couple times the term vision and the Doris Duke, obviously Doris Duke is a large foundation. You're working as a field worker. There are the tribes. There are all these different agents, if you will, involved in this project. As best as you can remember, what was that vision of the Doris Duke people for Native American history, and did it end up? Yeah.
So remember that this is Doris Duke's personal money that it's work here. That the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation did not exist at that time. Okay. And this is an idea she expressed to her colleague, I think probably an attorney that represented her in the 40s, that she thought that we should make an effort to garner the history of the American Indians. Of course, she's her world is the American Tobacco Company. That's her dad that develops that, and her family. And American tobacco is an American Indian plant, and so there's some pulled together pieces like that are very important. And I think it partly was some guilt that was prompting her. These people, they're disappearing, and their lands are disappearing. We got to do something. We got to. So, but I never had that said quite that way. But we were told by the representative who came out to visit us in the project that it was her idea, and her vision was to have a program that would allow the American Indian peoples to tell their own history. And that clearly by then, as Sam said in the interview that you did with him, that by 65, 64, oral history through Columbia and what was going on out at Berkeley at the regional oral history program and a few other places, oral history was on the move. And it was clearly, it was clear that it had a potential. The folklorists and the anthropologists had proven that. Lomax was he carried a refrigerator around to record folklorists in the Tennessee mountains, in the Appalachians areas in the 30s and 40s. I mean, how that guy did it, I don't know. I watched those old film clips and listen and I've read some about it. Just amazing. Anyway, so it clearly had the capacity to do it. And at the same time, Paul, there is a rise in interest in local history in the white communities. And if you go back and look at the bibliography for the period, you'll see that rise coming out in works that are beginning to have influence into the teaching programs for history departments and for graduate programs. And so, and you have the rise of both the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts. Those are early 60 programs. And all of a sudden there's money that's starting to flow. And I think all of those things come together to help push both the thought pattern of Doris Duke and her people, but also people like Sam and people like Crampton, people like Bunny Fontana at Arizona.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are huge in their emergence within that whole field, and they all played a role in the development and the techniques of oral history as we know it today.
Excellent, excellent. One last question, Greg, as we wrap up. I wanted to return to your graduate research. What kind of impacted? I mean, it's really, you're describing this amazing intellectual, social, political, academic milieu that's happening. A lot of things are coming together. It just sounds so vibrant. What kind of impact did this have on you as you were writing your dissertation? Were you trying to kind of incorporate some of that into your work?
Well, I did in my master's thesis directly. And what one of the other piece in this that was important, Floyd convinced Crampton that spending the money to send us to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. was worthy of the expenditure. And what we started doing very early, like I didn't go on the first trip with Floyd, I think he went alone, but I went on the second one. That was probably in 68. Went to the National Archives, and we went into the government records for American Indians. I don't know if you've used the National Archives or not, but what you find out very quickly is the national government thinks American Indians are natural resources, and their records are filed under the larger heading of natural resources. So the American Indian record for the government of the U.S. is record group number 75. And I lived a good part of my life in record group 75. And we worked on the Ute, all the Ute records. We built these archives to help sponsor knowledgeable oral history practices. And that part of the program, very historical and very historiographic in nature, is another important piece in how this comes about. And it's kind of hard to keep these threads moving around so they're understandable, but they all play. And by the time I was finishing up my thesis, I'd already been to a number of the major national resources for tribal records and tribal groups, and I had been both the federal set and the regional local record units for the federal government, but also the major public and academic institution holdings. And so it's another way in exposure. And my master's thesis was literally written from that kind of background, archival background, along with what we were learning as we were doing the oral history work with Southern Ute.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave you with one fun story, and then we'll need to go. But so we had put together this very large set of records for Southern Ute. This we had passed out of the Duke project. We were working on a tribal history for Southern Ute, and so we took the records to the tribal headquarters, and they had their own set of records. And my job for a week was to put everything together, label it, and present it to the tribal council as their working documentation for the administering of the tribe and the reservation. And so they had the money for me to do that, and they were paying the American West Center. And I was there, and it was great fun because there was nowhere to eat around there. So for lunch, I would go with the chairman, his brother, and several of the members of the council to the chair's brother's home for lunch.
Wow.
And they had a heyday. They loved teasing me. Oh my goodness, and we laughed and laughed. It was a marvelous experience. And so all done, and the check comes to the American West Center, and on the subject area, it is documented payment for fingering the documents, fingering the records.
Wow.
That was their way of defining what I was doing.
Wow.
And we laughed. I'm sorry we didn't take that check on post cancellation and frame it, put it up the wall.
And frame it, yeah, that would have been fun.
It tells you a lot. I mean, it was very expressive on how they were viewing it. They understood the importance of it, but
exactly.
Anyway,
That's great. That's really cool.
I've devoured tons of your time, and then probably didn't get you as far down the road as you wanted.
No, this has been wonderful, Greg. I want to, thank you for taking your time, and it's
Glad
just been
to do it.
It's such a learning experience for me and for Deborah, and eventually for our students and everyone. And we'll share the interviews, of course, with our colleagues at Doris Duke as well. You'll be glad to know that we're finally at the University of Florida. We've developed a Native American Studies program.
Good.
Rich Connolly is the chair of that. As a lot of things in Florida, we're playing catch up, right? Because, the political climate here. But having said that, let's go ahead and if it's cool with you, kind of schedule for next week another session.
I was just opening up my calendar right now.
Excellent.
We're getting pretty close to where we're going on campus, and I know things are getting. Actually, Todd has been carrying the heavy load on trying to get us into that. Right now I have a 9:00 appointment. Let's see, we're at Thursday, right?
Yes, sir. So Thursday, August 20th, if you have an appointment at 9, actually, I was going to ask you if we can meet just a little later, because I also have some morning appointments here.
It looks like I think we have a 12:00 appointment if we're wanting to go into this platform that the Doris Duke people are using. Merkur2.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
I think it's at 12. I don't think I have anything before that right now, and I could try to freeze that time.
Okay. So maybe you're saying
Would you like
10:30 your time?
Pardon?
Are you saying, Greg, because you have the 9 a.m., are you saying maybe 10:30?
No, I don't have it. Not on that day. I was starting to look at Friday. So Thursday, I'm wide open in the morning.
Oh, I see. Okay. So what about, and right now your time, I'm with Zoom, the era of Zoom, I'm so mixed up my time frames right now.
I'm 2 hours behind you. I'm at 10:30.
Okay.
We are. Todd and I.
Okay, excellent. So what about, say, 10:30 your time, 12:30 Florida time? Does that work?
And that's on the 20th. Did I get the right?
That's on the 20th.
So 10:30?
Yes. And then we can do about an hour, and then we can wrap up for the noontime meeting.
I'm just locking it in now.
Okay, cool. So I'll put 12:30 our time, Florida time. And that works for you, Deborah?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Todd, are you okay with that?
That's good for me. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much. It has been very enlightening.
Paul, I want to compliment you. The sophistication that you have given your program and the way you're doing things is extraordinary, and I'm sure that you're probably leading the country in your whole approach. And
Thank you.
it's impressive. I really enjoyed thank you, Deborah, for hooking into the interviews and the little presentation you did for your legacy group to Sam and all. It's impressive.
Thank you, Greg. Well, we have
Well done.
great colleagues. Deborah is our longest tenured member. She connects us to Sam's amazing legacies, and the family, the Proctor family, continues to be a great support. So we have this great community that's built up, and so yeah, we all kind of lean together during hard times. So we're holding in there. Yeah.
I have a question real quick. Duke question. I believe Sam, in the interview with you, Paul, I think he's talking about C. Gregory Crampton coming from Utah to meet with him. I think that's the person that it is. He doesn't name him ever, but and I think Greg probably got a hold of Sam through Floyd's meeting at Arrowhead with Sam.
That's really that meeting, and I'm so excited to share this also, with my colleagues in the Oral History Association, because as you know, that meeting, those meetings by now are just legendary, and
oh yes,
in the lore of the Oral History Association. So, yeah, no, this has been wonderful to learn all these.
I think he says that your portion of the Duke funding was $250,000. Is that?
I think that's about right.
Because the other day when we were together with the other members of the Duke group, and I think maybe it was Oklahoma, said theirs was 200,000. I think that's wrong. I think everybody got $250,000. We did, and I think Sam said that as well for the South Dakota bunch. But we ultimately may have gotten a little more for administering the whole program and acting as the accountant, if you will.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to, because when I heard that, I thought that isn't right. And some point we probably should set that up on the record and see if it holds on the record.
Exactly.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Todd. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much.
Be safe and be well.
All right, you too. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.